Hey everybody, this is Darren back with a new episode of Superpowered Fancast. And on this episode, comic book writer David Pepose returns to the Fancast to talk about his new project and talk about some projects he's currently still working on. He is if you remember from the last episode, he is the writer of Space Ghost for Dynamite, Speed Racer for Mad Cave Studios. He's also the writer of the Savage Avengers series for Marvel as well. But this episode, we're going to talk about both Space Ghost and Speed Racer. We're also going to be talking about the OZ, which is his dark and gritty take on the Wizard of Oz. And the Kickstarter for the third issue series finale is now live on Kickstarter. We talk about comics. We talk about the new addition he's about to have to his family. But I'm going to let you go ahead and check it out, and you tell me what you think in the comments. So without further ado, David Pepose returns. David, thank you so much for coming back on Superpower Fancast. First thing I want to say, though, is because I follow you on social media. So beyond all of your success and everything else, I want to say congratulations on your announcement. On your
Thank you. Thank you. I have a baby coming, and currently she's due within like 72 hours of this Kickstarter wrapping. So that's going to be a wild transition for all
Yeah.
involved. That was the delivery date got bumped up just before I launched. But you know, they say that's good practice for parenthood. So
Mhm.
yeah, I'm very excited. It's been a long time coming. She's an IVF baby. But I always, I asked the universe to give me my own Jan and Jace, and so far I'm 50% of the way there.
Yeah, well, congratulations as a father of two. I welcome anyone into the fold. So
Thank you. I'm very excited.
yeah, but speaking of collaborations and and new things coming out, one, I want to congratulate you on Space Ghost. I'm loving the arc. I had already reviewed the last issue, and I love how it ended, and I love the fact that like you're setting up so many great things for the characters, but also like giving some really great resolution to other parts of the arc. Like,
Yeah.
what are you? What's been, uh, I guess, kind of the most gratifying element of kind of putting this book out the way you want to put it out, but also kind of where do you see Space Ghost and his team kind of going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's funny because this is the first interview I've done since Space Ghost Volume 2, number 12 came out. And it's kind of freeing to be able to talk about it because this is sort of a twist that I've been keeping secret for really the better part of 18 months. I
Mhm.
turned in my outline for year two. Um, it was last January, January of 25. So this has been in the works for some time now. But yeah, for those who haven't been following Space Ghost, which Jonathan Lau and I kind of relaunched it as sort of Batman, The Long Halloween meets The
Mhm.
Mandalorian. And season two, our first season, our 13 issue run, people really liked it. Dynamite was thrilled with it. And so around issue 10 of that first volume, both me and Dynamite kind of came to the same conclusion independently about what would happen if we extended the run. Unlike season one, which had a very firm runway from start to finish, volume two was kind of the little indie that could, in that it got extended multiple times. At first, it was going to just be an extra 5 issues. And I asked, could we do 8? And then quickly that extended to 10. And then it extended to 12, and now 13 with our upcoming annual, which is up for pre-orders. The pre-order final order cutoff is on the 22nd. And so, but through it all, kind of the core of year two was about escalation. And then I just, I heard a review just this week actually of issue 12 that really kind of crystallized all the themes for volume two retroactively for me, which is it's also about loss.
Yeah.
In that we meet Jan and Jace, Space Ghost's young orphaned sidekicks. They meet their estranged grandfather, Dr. Henry Contra, for the first time at the end of Volume One, and so we had that kind of subplot building through most of the series, and he becomes the villainous antimatter man, sort of the Harvey Dent of our series. But we've also had a villain sort of in waiting in the wings, operating in the shadows through various proxies called Tempest the Time Master. And when I was working on developing Space Ghost Season 2, I needed somebody who had the same threat level or more than the Council of Doom, which is sort of Space Ghost's core heavy hitters, uniting as a supervillain team. And so Tempest, out of all of Space Ghost's rogues gallery, felt like the one that had the sufficient stakes, the sufficient scale behind all of it. And so we've been sort of playing up Tempest and his hunt of space ghosts all across the multiverse and absorbing their powers so he can feed it to his time shredder machine that he can use to basically rewrite reality to his whims. And what was fun is that we've sort of been holding this secret in the back pocket. And I guess spoilers on earmuffs if you don't want to know what's happening in Space Ghost Volume 2, number 12. If you haven't read it yet, you're still going to read it, just cover your ears right now. Something I've had in the back pocket for a long time is that Tempest is actually Thaddeus Bach, who is the Space Ghost in the 2005 Space Ghost miniseries.
Right.
And I think our book, in a lot of ways, for better or for worse, has been in conversation with that miniseries. They came out basically a generation before us, and those Alex Ross covers are so iconic. And it was Space Ghost's, I think, first, modern series as a superhero. And at the same time, like I read that miniseries when I was preparing for the first year of stories, but there were certain things that I really wanted to do differently, particularly the focus on Jan and Jace, because they really only barely appear in that '05 miniseries. And I remember being struck. I had read that miniseries before I watched any of the cartoons. I read it when I was an intern at DC back in '08. And so when I watched the cartoons, I was so struck by how important Jan and Jace were compared to what I'd seen in the miniseries. And as I was thinking about like what's a good way to make Tempest personal, that struck me as, oh, this is sort of the Space Ghost without Jan and Jace's kind of influence, baked into the core. And so I've been really pleased with the response to that, especially with the diehard fans who kind of immediately clocked what we were doing as soon as we made that reveal. But also there's the more casual fans who like look it up, either in the Wikipedia or the Hanna-Barbera wiki or the Space Ghost wiki, and they're like, oh, he dug deep into
that was some deep cut.
It was a deep cut. But I think it was sort of my way of trying to kind of put that conversation to rest a little bit, because, I mean, I really do consider the work that Jonathan and I have done as sort of the definitive modern Space Ghost in a lot of ways. I think we've put in the hours. I think we've got, we've earned the accolades. I think we've earned that distinction. But as a result, we kind of had to sort of put the past to rest in a way that was kind of unmistakable, and in a way that would sort of separate our Space Ghost from all the other generations of Space Ghost reinventions that have come before. So, but yeah, and then beyond that, we also wanted to sort of have some emotional stakes to it. I mean, I don't think it's any secret that the core formula of our Space Ghost run, broken up mostly in done in ones and done in twos, was sort of the big 3-part crescendos, is that it's the villain of the week, of course, and figuring out new and interesting ways to sort of have each villain stake their own claim in terms of powers and tones and influences. But it's also Space Ghost's ever evolving dynamic with Jan and Jace, sort of this cosmic vigilante who sort of accidentally becomes a surrogate father figure to these twins, and how they go from being orphans to sidekicks to partners to sort of filling the void that this widower's had since his family was killed. Sort of these broken families combining into sort of an unorthodox whole. And so every issue, I'm always sort of, how do we tie back into that? If we don't have something that feels sufficient with Jan and Jace, then something's missing. So we got to figure that out. And so, issue 12, again, spoilers, earmuffs. We wanted to have a good send off for Space Spectre, the grim anti-hero future version of Jace. We introduced him in volume 1. And as I was writing that issue, that's when we started talking about doing a volume 2. And so I started to seed in those breadcrumbs of Tempest, really at the 11th hour during our lettering pass, believe it or not. And so I wanted to pay that off. I loved Space Spectre as a character. That issue is probably one of my favorites of year 1. And so doing sort of the reverse of, he's no longer an antagonist to our heroes, but now he's got to kind of team up with his own past. I was like, okay, this is a fun sort of substitute for Space Ghost, and Space Ghost has been separated from the pack. But it also sort of represented a loose end that I could kind of cut for some really fun emotional payoff. And so, Space Spectre, who, was introduced as somebody who was kind of driven by desperation and a sense of resentment and bitterness over his mentor's failures, winds up sacrificing himself to save Space Ghost and to save the universe as a whole. And sort of Jace's doomed future winds up having, winds up being justified. It winds up having this payoff. And, writing, writing that end of that issue broke my heart. Like I always try to go for emotions in the work. I always try to make the readers cry. I don't always make myself cry. But when I do, I'm like, okay, I've nailed it. And as I was sort of writing Space Ghost, like just panicking over his future ward dying in his arms, I mean, it's the middle of the night in my office, and I'm like, why, who's cutting the onions? But that's going to lead us to our annual, which is up for pre-orders, like I said. And yeah, in the wake of Tempest's rampage, in the wake of Space Spectre's death, Space Ghost finds himself kind of at a crossroads. This is his long, dark night of the soul. And this annual came kind of at the 11th hour. Like it came at such kind of a late juncture that's the reason why all the solicits for issue 12 say it's the last issue of the run, when it's not. That's sort of, again, a weird quirk of how you make comics, but you have to write these solicits well in advance of me even writing the scripts. And so, as I was about to start writing issue 12, my editor, Joe Rybandt, emailed me and said, listen, volume 1 was 13 issues. I want a 13th issue. And so after pulling my hair and screaming to a pillow for a minute, I realized I don't have to speed run the emotional fallout of Space Spectre's death. I can kind of make a meal out of it with this annual. And so the annual is kind of a bookend to the first issue of volume 2, which started off as a conversation. We had Jan and Jace meeting Dr. Contra for the first time and explaining, why does the universe need a Space Ghost? And now, in the wake of Space Spectre's death, Space Ghost is asking, does the universe still need a Space Ghost? And can I continue on this path as both a superhero and a surrogate father? Sort of the balance is now completely out of whack. And meanwhile, we're going to cut back and forth between a really fun adventure with Space Ghost and the twins, featuring Magnus and the Alien, who are two of my favorite obscure Space Ghost films. Magnus is basically the Stiltman of the Space Ghost universe. He's a thief with a suit of armor that sort of telescopes, his arms and legs. You can see it in Jerry Ordway's really fun variant cover for the book. And then his partner, who's this mysterious reality warping being known only as the Alien. He speaks in his own unintelligible alien dialect that only Magnus understands. And it's funny because I actually wrote full dialogue for the Alien, and then I told Taylor Esposito, make this thing illegible. So break out your codex if you want to translate stuff. Um, and Yeah, they've been stealing from Salvage Worlds in the wake of Tempest's rampage. They've stolen a bit of technology that's particularly volatile, and so um, it could blow up half the city if it's not contained quickly. And so Space Ghost and the twins are playing this game of hot potato with them. And without spoiling too much, there's more to this heist than meets the eye that's going to sort of hit Space Ghost exactly at his weak spot in this sort of and bring this kind of crisis of faith to a head. So, yeah, Space Ghost is going to have a conversation with a really unexpected source. And it's really sort of going to get a little bit more into his head than we're used to seeing. But, it's sort of, we started this series with a question. Do we need a Space Ghost? And I think we are taking a stab at actually delivering an answer with this annual. But more importantly, the annual is also going to tee up our big fall event that's kicking off in September. Um, we are bringing in Alex Toth's other team of sci-fi adventurers, the Herculoids, into our series. And so we're kicking off with a big 5-part event, Space Coast and the Herculoids. So that'll be September through January, I believe. And then that'll lead us into Space Coast Volume 3, kicking off in 2027. And yeah, for those who aren't familiar with the Herculoids, imagine if Conan the Barbarian lived in space.
Yeah.
He married Shanna the She-Devil. Their son was like the tween version of Disney's Tarzan. And they hung out with 5 interstellar kaiju to protect their world from pirates and industrialists looking to pillage their ecosystem. That's the Herculoids in a nutshell. We've got Xandor, the space barbarian, who grew up fighting in the pits as a gladiator of kyanite, side by side with his battle beast, Tundro, the living tank. And he, became a champion in his own right, so renowned that Emperor Neron himself decided he was too much trouble and sicked an enslaved protoplasm called Gloop to try to wipe Xandor and Tundro out. And that would have been the end of their story, except they were rescued by the daughter of the village elder Corsac. Her name is Tara, who basically, coming from sort of this privileged upbringing, was moonlighting as a freedom fighter. And so she liberated the pits with the help of Zoc, the star dragon, and her trusted rock ape, her pet and familiar Igu. And so Tara kind of gave Xandor a second chance at life and taught him that their homeworld of Amzot, as beautiful and dangerous and alien as it is, there's more to it than just death and blood and violence and pain. That it is a free world, that everyone who's on it is meant to be free. And that kind of gave Xandor a sense of purpose. It sort of healed those old wounds. And when his son Dorno was born, it sort of created this family. And even Gloop, this protoplasm who was the most alien of the Herculoids, recognized something in that moment and split off into a smaller clone named Glebe, which became Dorno's sort of loyal protoplasmic guard dog in a lot of ways. And so I love the Herculoids in that, you get to inject science fantasy into the sci-fi superhero universe of Space Ghost. It's sort of you get kind of that noble sword and sorcery fantasy, but also kind of a weird alien, almost Addams Family kind of
Yeah,
undercurrent
yeah,
to it.
and
Like
that's one of the
something.
things I'm interested in seeing is just kind of seeing how those two groups interact.
Yeah, it's fun to kind of explore, the contrasts and the similarities between the two because
Yeah.
Space Ghost at his core, he's a superhero. He defends the defenseless. He's the sole survivor of the invasion of Planet Vector, and so he's dedicated his life to making sure that nobody else has to suffer the way he did, including Jan and Jace. And at the same time, though, even though he's a cosmic vigilante, even though he operates on the outside of the law, even though he knows that there's corruption in the Galactic Federation, he still defends the Galactic Federation. I think it's still greater than the sum of its failings. He is still a defender of the status quo when you boil him down.
Yeah.
And the Herculoids, meanwhile, Amzot is all they have. They are firmly anti-establishment because what
Yeah.
has the establishment ever tried to do besides enslave them and try to pillage their world? So they're not superheroes as much as they are liberators. They
Right.
are their mission,
Revolutionaries in that.
yeah, their mission is to protect people, to defend them from enslavement and exploitation. On their homeworld of Amzot, they're basically a nuclear deterrent. That
Right.
any nation that wants to invade its neighbors, they're going to have to weigh their options because otherwise they're going to risk having Xandor and his Herculoids up in their business. And
Mhm.
meanwhile, anybody who, has maybe heard the rumors of Amzot, who has, maybe sort of, pieced together enough star charts to find this world, the Herculoids are the ones that send them packing.
Yeah.
And so these missions, while similar, do have some core differences. The Herculoids, their mission is not to kill first, but they're not going to lose any sleep if that's
Right.
what it comes
Yeah.
down to. Whereas Space Ghost has a firm no kill rule. And so it's also Space Ghost is used to being the toughest guy in the room. I think, especially my take on the character, he's a little bit of a grouch. He leads with his fists,
Yeah.
and I think he takes a perverse sense of pride in knowing he's the toughest guy in the room. But Xandor's not from around here, and he's not buying what this creep in a mask is selling. And so there's going to be some real friction between the two of them. Uh,
Good.
like Space Ghost and Speed Racer, and I watched every episode of the Herculoids to kind of wrap my mind around all this and get a sense of how these characters work and to try to build a little bit of a backstory based on that pre-established iconography. And so, building on the 10-issue run that Tom Snignowski wrote, we are leaving sort of his plot threads for him to pick up if and when he ever returns to the
Right.
series. But between watching episodes like The Gladiators of Kyanite, which really kind of informed my take on Xandor and his past, sort of, similar to Space Ghost, sort of deep well of pain, but over a much longer continuum, and he's maybe adjusted to it a little bit better. The thing that really kind of struck me is the Herculoids had a weapon in their slingshots called energy rocks. There were
Mhm.
little glowing pellets that would
Yeah.
explode on impact. But having watched an episode called The Purple Menace, I was able to kind of extrapolate that Amzot is sort of their entire ecosystem is powered by this element that we are calling quasarite. And not only can, little pellets explode on impact, but this is a conduit of raw cosmic energy that sort of feeds the hypermutated flora and fauna that makes Amzot such a unique and dangerous and deadly world. Um, if you absorb it into your bloodstream, if you ingest it, it can increase your speed and strength and durability. And Xandor and his family and the Herculoids themselves, by their own unique physiology, they've been absorbing trace elements of quasarite into their systems their entire lives. So they're strong enough and tough enough to go toe to toe with somebody like Space Ghost. However, this thing can also power ships, it can power cities, it can power weapons, it can power bombs. And that means that Quasarite is not going to be hidden forever.
Right.
And when somebody makes a grab for it, it's going to trigger a domino effect that's going to send Xandor and his Herculoids on the warpath.
Gotcha.
And so that's going to put him kind of head to head with Space Ghost and company. And so, I love injecting all sorts of different genres into Space Ghost. That's one of the treats of this book is Space Ghost can carry all these different stories organically on his shoulders by virtue of his core concept. Um, and so, of course, I like to cross pollinate, but I also love playing the hits. I love kind of
Mhm.
getting to play with all the different superhero tropes. And so, doing the superhero misunderstanding into a team up, I've
Yeah.
never had a chance to do that. And this felt like such a fun way to kind of have the Herculoids really prove themselves from the jump. We didn't have 2 years of done in ones to establish them in the same way that we did for Space Ghost. So I wanted the Herculoids' first adventure in our books to be the biggest, most bombastic blockbuster that Jonathan and I could deliver.
Right.
This is our first experiment with longer form storytelling. This is a 5-issue event. And it's fun to kind of like, do the chocolate and the peanut butter and then mix and match a little bit. You're going to see the Herculoids in combat in an urban environment, which is really cool to see the different ways that they can kind of navigate all these things. You're going to see Space Ghost and Company dealing with the dangers of the jungles of Amazon. And
Mhm.
we've also got villains from both sides of the street. We've got the Evil Collector, who's one of my favorite Space Ghost villains. He's kind of like
Yeah.
the Brainiac of Space Ghost lore. He likes to shrink people and feed them to his cat. Mutant cat. Um, and we've sort of recontextualized him as the chief warden of the Galactic Federation. So he's tasked with keeping the worst of the worst locked down. So he wears that name, the Evil Collector, as sort of like a perverse badge of honor.
Right.
Uh, but of course, his name is the Evil Collector. So
Right.
of course,
Yeah.
some ulterior motives going on.
So in his mind, he's collecting evil, but yeah.
Yeah, but also
Yeah.
like there's a little sadism to him. Like the idea of his collection of all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
There's something that he's looking for his collection that is going to really kind of blow up in our heroes' faces in a big way. And then from the Herculoid side of the street, we have Meccano, the Machine Man, who's one of my favorite Herculoids villains. And we've sort of contextualized him as the evil collector's lieutenant, sort of this
Hmm.
enslaved android who's also part of the evil collector's
Yeah.
uh, collection. And he's sort of this super intelligence, but also he is deadly. Like from the moment you see him, he's under he's on the leash, but you know that like if the evil collector kind of like gave him a little nod, he's the
Right.
last thing you see before you die. And so that's they've got an interesting dynamic that's going to sort of have some unique story elements to it. But yeah, these characters are super fun. Getting to watch everybody sort of mix and match and play off of each other, and seeing the way that Jonathan Lau has sort of made these characters his own. He's
Yeah.
really sort of he's done a great job with the Herculoids, really putting his own unique stamp on them. But even like Xandor and Tara, I've seen some pages from issue one. They they're really into each other, like it's very much like Leonidas and Gorgo from 300. There's some heat coming off those things. I didn't know Jonathan had it in him.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm definitely looking forward to the art for the for this
yeah,
series.
so he's drawing issue two as we speak, and I'm writing issue three as we speak. But yeah, this is really fun, and it's gonna, I wanted to expand Space Coast universe. I wanted to cross-pollinate with all the different villains from both sides of the street, and we're gonna be doing more of that in volume three. My goal is to sort of make year three kind of our Brave and the Bold era. So you're gonna see a lot of kind of fun, unexpected team ups, both with the Herculoids and some other characters that we may have already established, and maybe a few other characters that are going to be kind of new to the fold. Warner Brothers has been amazing as partners on this book, and so they've really given us a ton of latitude, even more than our license necessarily formally allows, because they believe in us. They believe in our story, and so yeah, Jonathan and I believe we're still figuring out the exact runway for year three. I believe we are committed through at least issue 44. My goal is to get us committed to issue 50. And so I'm still kind of putting some pieces together for all of that. But we know how the series is going to end. I've already outlined the final arc of this, so I know where we are building. It's just figuring out sort of what the runway is getting there. But lots of fun stuff to come from me and Jonathan. I know that it said in the solicits that issue 12 was the finale, and that's because when we wrote those solicits, it was. But since those solicits were written, not only did we
Yeah,
get this sort of
I guess if
Herculoids.
anything, you say it's the finale of this particular arc. Like
Yeah,
it's not
yeah.
the end.
We the curse of continuing to expand as we keep on trucking. But I've already told Dynamite I would really love to be on for 50. If me and Jonathan can pull it off, that would. I don't think there's been a superhero team to do 50 straight issues
Right.
since Bendis and Bagley. So that would be, I think, a real feather in our cap. And it's all because of the amazing fans who supported us every step of the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of building, I think again, I'm absolutely excited about where Space Ghost is going. I wanted to get to that 50 issues because there's so much great story going on already that
Yeah.
it can only get better from here. But I want to, again, speaking of building, you're building some really great storytelling in Speed Racer as well.
Thank
Like
you.
I am really enjoying just how different it feels, but also still has that same like familiar kind of anime manga uh
Yeah.
feel to it, both in kind of story and character, but it's taken some really big interesting swings. Like I'm loving like the issue that just came out where Speed is affected by a gas. It's kind of turning him into a
A real
douchebag, but
jerk.
it's yeah, but
Yeah. Uh,
it's really interesting, especially like mixing both the the racing elements, the adventure elements, but also the interpersonal conflict. And
Thank
just
you.
kind of is that kind of what you were going for?
Yeah.
Just
You hit it
talk
right
about
on
the
the
series
head.
itself.
Yeah, for Speed Racer, I mean, we took a lot of there's a lot of shared DNA with Speed Racer and Space Ghost in terms of the approach and how we're pacing it, and I think I love writing kind of the interpersonal relationships between characters. I think that when you don't have sort of an ensemble cast, whether it's a bunch of supporting characters or whether it's a full-on team, it's challenging because you don't have a lot of people to play off of. But I think Speed Racer, like Space Ghost, I watched every episode to prepare for it. I'm only 40, so I missed like the heyday
Yeah.
of Speed Racer. And I was always very struck at the supporting cast. It was really vibrant, and they juggled a lot, to the point where like we had to make some sort of some decisions in terms of like Ma Racer, for example.
Yeah.
She and Pop split, and part of that was just logistics. It's just like
Mhm.
we not only does the whole series hinge on Pop's needing a heart transplant. And so I didn't want a second parent for Speed to lean on, but it's one more character that you have to, devote page time and spotlight to.
Yeah. But it's
And
also the opportunity for a great to keep a kind of a mystery for fans
yeah. Well,
uh
I
think
will
about
say
it.
that, like, as I say all this, Ma Racer, there are plans. This is something that we've got in the back pocket for when the time is right. But she we didn't just write
Don't
her out and
spoil
forget
anything for
about her. She
yeah.
actually does have a very important role to
Yeah.
play. I believe in 27. So in 2027, I should say. Um, so yeah, but yeah, I think for me, Speed Racer, it's Rocky in a race car. That's what I pitched it as, is it's somebody who's got all this raw talent and passion, but he's got a lot of lessons to learn and a lot of growing up to do. And I thought, what better way to do that than sort of to build up his supporting cast? And so he has to learn all these lessons from Trixie and Pops and Racer X and Spritle. And so also, I just want to make these characters fun for me to write. And so, giving them stuff to do is sort of the best way to get them on the page for me. But yeah, this issue that also came out this week, same as Space Coast, Speed Racer 9, our Demon on Wheels storyline, our two-parter that's kicked off. And that came from a couple of different sources. Like I said, I watched every episode. And my favorite episodes are it's the fastest car on Earth. That's my
Yeah.
favorite two-part. That introduced the GRX engine, which was sort of our big storyline for issues 6 and 7, our Creed 2 of
Yeah.
Speed Racer. And I remember watching those episodes, and I love the GRX engine. I thought that was really cool, and I thought the idea of Curly Cranham, sort of showing up at the 11th hour is like you can make a real meal out of this guy.
Yeah.
But they also have a subplot involving VGAS, which is something that basically is a performance enhancer in those episodes that if you're not on VGAS, you don't have the reflexes to pilot the GRX engine. But
Right.
also it makes you hydrophobic. And so if you drink water, then you basically like you lose all the benefits, but you sort of like, start to lose your mind and you become deathly afraid of going fast.
Right.
And I remember thinking at the time, with all respect, that I was like, oh, that's kind of a hat on a hat. Like, you don't need the
Yeah, that's a lot.
VRX story work. But I was like, it's a really cool concept, of sort of the good guy turning heel, and having to sort of overcome those inner demons. And it also spoke to the theme song,
Yeah.
there he goes, Speed Racer, he's a demon on wheels.
Demon
It's
on
the
wheels. Yeah.
first line of the theme song. And it always felt like a very specific choice for such a wholesome character. And so I was like, okay, Demon on Wheels, like that's a cool turn of phrase. We've got the VGAS in this episode. We can build a storyline over this. And I think to kind of circle back to the point you were making earlier, it allows us to pay off all those interpersonal relationships we've been building over the course of the series. Is that when the chips are down and Speed has been dosed with this gas that is made, is just completely untethered him from any sense of fear or fair play or any sort of moral compass. If Speed is unleashed, it's his family that can kind of like bring him back from the brink.
Yeah,
And so, we've done the setup in issue 9.
yeah,
Seeing Speed really turn heel, seeing him fight Mark Meglaton, who was another hat on a hat villain from the original series. He was like a James Bond mastermind wearing a mask and holding cities hostage with rockets and telling them to give him their most expensive paintings, their rarest paintings, and forcing Speed to be his unwitting errand boy to collect all these paintings. And at the time, even for Speed Racer, I was like, that's a lot. But such an interesting visual. He had this like Picasso-like mask that I was like, what if we sort of simplified him a little bit, to sort of distill his core characteristics, but in a little bit more of a cohesive way for our world. So making him this pop art themed Formula X driver. Then he's got his two wheelmen, Dolly and Magritte, and I spent way too much time on Google Translate coming up with the dumbest Magritte joke in the world. But yeah, like that felt like a nice sort of way to ease people into Speed being a jerk, is that we have this sort of very heightened theatrical villain that then Speed can absolutely make mincemeat out of. And so that issue was a lot of fun to write. I took a lot of influence from Grant Morrison's first issue on Batman, where
Mhm.
Batman's fighting the Ninja Man Bats in the Pop Art Museum. I thought that was a really fun kind of thing to explore. But now that issue 10 is coming out, and as we're talking, the pre-orders were today, but now we're going to pay all this off because Racer X has sort of been weaving in and out of the shadows
Yeah,
in this story like a shark. He's the only one that really knows what happened to Speed, in that this V gas has a connection to his past and when he trained in the jungles of Capetapec, which is a nod to the original show. And so he knows that this is sort of almost like a Batman Begins kind of fear gas,
yeah,
except it's an aggression gas. And so in issue 10, I'll spoil, it's going to be Speed versus Racer X in
yeah.
the heart of
And
an active
that's
volcano.
and
Uh,
and to be honest with you, that's one of the things that I have been looking forward to because
yeah,
I like how they've just kind of been like circling each other. And
yeah,
but I've wanted to see them just commit to something that's either going to reveal something to about each other to each other, or
yeah,
just kind of let Speed know that there's someone out there that you
yeah.
know
Well, it's
that
going to
is
be a
that
team
is just as
effort.
good, if not better.
It's going to be a real team effort.
Yeah,
Issue 10 in particular, you see Pops and Spritle and Racer X and Trixie. They're all trying to sort of like stop Speed from doing something he might regret.
right,
Uh, and yeah, it's a fun issue, and one that I think pays off a lot of these kind of emotional beats to wrap up our second arc. And then I know Mad Cave usually has a break in between arcs. So if you don't see us in the next solicits, we're not canceled. I'm committed through issue 15 at the least. But that sort of allows the creative team to catch our breaths, and just sort of allow us to keep building that backlog of material. So, we stay consistent and on time. But I'm already hard at work on the third arc. Davide Tinto is inking issue 11 as we speak. I'm writing issue 12. Yeah, we've got the Melange showing up, which is a classic Speed Racer villain. And I'm really excited for some of the fun stuff we got planned for that one. Writing the Melange kind of reminded me a little bit of writing Space Spectre,
hmm,
in that it's sort of one of those villains that's just like so cool they steal the show. So yeah, it basically the Melange is like the evil version of Racer X. This masked vigilante, this armored vigilante as well, has been picking off corrupt Formula X officials. And when Racer X tried to stop them, he got beat pretty bad for his troubles, and now the police think he did it. And so this puts Speed in kind of an interesting environment. It's another adventure that's off the tracks. That it for somebody as headstrong and reckless as Speed can be, he's now forced into kind of a detective story where he's got to
Yeah.
figure out what is the melange, who set up Racer X, can he clear his friend's name by himself without that sort of wingman there to protect him. So that's a really fun story that's going to kind of lead to our big capstone three-parter of the Formula X championships. And we'll find out that, Dante Furno, the head of the car acrobatic team, he's tired of Speed winning. He's tried to take him out through various proxies, and now he's going to get his own hands dirty
Yeah.
because Dante Furno, as we revealed back in issue 2, used to have another life as a racer before he went corporate. And so he's going to suit up one more time as the ruthless Captain Terror. And you're going to learn that Dante hasn't lost a step. And so things are going to get real bad for Speed before they get better. And similar to what we're doing on the Demon on Wheels storyline, it's going to be a team effort. His whole family is going to have to sort of help him put the pieces back together and come back stronger than ever.
Well, that's
Um,
definitely one of the things that I've been enjoying so much about Speed Racer has been like he started off with he can do everything on his own. He's got this. He doesn't need anybody's help, and he's just learning over and over again that he needs these people around him. And
yeah,
yeah, and that's great.
yeah,
That's great development character wise, in my opinion.
yeah. I just figured, with a supporting cast kind of as sprawling as Speed Racers, you want to justify that. And so giving everybody something to do. And also it's kind of a fun bit of characterization. This world is driven by passion. I mean, Speed himself is a creature of passion. But we said it in our free comic book day issue. Palm City is the ultimate racing town. And there's a million stories with a million engines that are all sort of circling around this particular axis of Formula X as a sport and as a calling and as a passion. And so seeing the different ways that passion can be reflected in the supporting cast. You've got Pops, who is sort of like the Da Vinci of mechanics, who now is sort of disillusioned with the sport because, his son Rex was thought to have been killed. And when we start the series, he firmly does not want Speed to race. Like he thinks it's dangerous and he doesn't want to lose another son to this. But once he, has his heart attack and then wakes up from his coma and sees that Speed is already sort of embarked on this journey to Formula X to pay for a heart transplant. He's like, the only way I can keep my son safe is if I train him. So he becomes kind of the corner man. You've got Trixie, who is sort of the Carol Ferris to Speed's Hal Jordan. We wanted to give her a real sense of importance and agency beyond just being the girlfriend.
Girlfriend. Yeah.
So she's a team owner. She inherited it from her father. It's the only way she keeps the Turnwell name alive, but it's struggling, just like Speed is. And so she and Speed have, had this will they or won't they? Now they will. But like they need each other for their respective goals. But also, like, how do you balance that romance with being, that's your employee?
Right.
And so for her, racing is a sense of responsibility. Sometimes it can be a little bit of a burden, but she sees in Speed that she remembers the joy and the freedom that comes with driving. Like it sort of helps her reignite that passion beyond sort of just the crushing, responsibilities. And Spritel, kind of the motor mouth color commentator. Like he's Speed without the trauma of losing his brother because he was too young to remember Rex, and so he's got that sense of idealism. Speed's his hero. And while he doesn't necessarily have the raw talent behind the wheel that Speed does, he's the fast talker. He's the one who, is he's the live streamer because that
Yeah.
was sort of our way of kind of giving Spritel a little more agency than what he had in the original
Right.
cartoon.
He wasn't just hiding in a trunk. It's like
Yeah, and so that was kind of a fun way of sort of exploring different sides of the same sport, and even Racer X, who sees racing as a way to sort of settle old scores and right the things that
yeah.
went wrong. Once he realizes that Speed's on the track, he's like, I have to protect my brother.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I've sort of let them all think I'm dead to try to protect them. And so he's sort of on this kind of balancing act, this tightrope of like, how do I like, protect my brother
How do I
without
stay close but not get too close?
not
Yeah.
get too close. And so, you know, um, these characters are all really fun, and then finding different ways for the villains to sort of have their own kind of unique high concept one way or the other. And so, um, it's been a really fun series. It's one of the more technically demanding books I've written, because we're fitting in at least one race in every issue, sometimes two. But Davide Tinto is the perfect collaborator in this book. He and I had worked on an issue of Avengers Unlimited together years ago, and we caught up at New York Comic Con right after I had turned in my outline for this series. And yeah, it was sort of the stars aligned. I was like, you would be excellent at a Speed Racer book. I know you've already done Ultraman and Star Trek, and he's so fast. He usually juggles two books at once, and so we were able to kind of have this be his schedule. And he, he having the right artist would make or break this book. And he is really, I think, one of the leading car chase laureates of modern comics. He's right up there with Trad Moore and Sean Murphy and David Asha. Like every single issue, he is making these races look good. So it's a real treat to work with him. He's a real sweetheart. I like him a lot, and yeah, he's got some fun stuff coming, both in issue 10 and in our future issues to come.
Yeah. And speaking of like villains, I mean, you got as I'm interested in this is the whole reason why I wanted to talk to you is this
Yeah.
the, as soon as I saw the title that said the Scarecrow War, I was like, okay, I gotta talk about the OZ because I
Yeah.
want to know, like, I mean, I want to know kind of where the idea for, and I know this is the third issue, but just kind of
Yeah.
where the idea stemmed for this kind of darker take on the Oz mythology. Like, kind
Yeah.
of
Well,
where did that come from?
for those who aren't familiar with the OZ, because it's been a very long journey to get here, our first Kickstarter was in 2020. The OZ is like what if Mad Max took place in The Wizard of Oz. It's the story of Dorothy Gale's granddaughter and namesake, who is an Iraq war veteran who's struggling with disillusionment and PTSD from her time overseas. And when she comes home to Kansas to take care of her ailing grandmother, a tornado strikes, and suddenly our new Dorothy finds herself stranded in the war-torn land of Oz, where she learns that not only were all of her grandmother's tall tales true, but that killing two wicked witches and exposing the Wizard of Oz and then abruptly vanishing, that's not the happy ending we've been led to believe. It just led to a power vacuum, not unlike Baghdad, which plunged the land of Oz into decades of brutal civil war. And so now our new Dorothy is teaming up with her grandmother's former friends, the Tin Soldier, the Prince of Lions, and Jack Pumpkinhead, in order to stop the iron fisted tyrant of Oz, the Scarecrow, and to bring peace to the occupied zone, or as the locals call it, the OZ. And yeah, this series has been a long time coming. Like I said, our first Kickstarter was in 2020, and our second one was in 2021. And I've been lucky enough to kind of have a whole ass career in between our last Kickstarter. I had only just been tapped to start writing Savage Avengers over at Marvel. We hadn't even announced it yet. So that last Kickstarter, a lot of people didn't know my name. I had no Marvel work behind me. I hadn't done Space Ghost or Speed Racer. I've been very fortunate to have a lot more eyes on my career since then. And so this third Kickstarter has been a long time coming. We've been working on it since the last one. I wrote the OZ. I finished writing the OZ before our first Kickstarter. So I always want to make it clear this was not Pepose got tapped at Marvel and he said, screw Kickstarter. Quite the
Yeah,
opposite in that, our amazing artist, Ruben Rojas, life just kind of hit him, in that he got married, he had a kid, he was in Spain during the worst of COVID, which really did a number on the local economy. I
yeah,
believe they were living with either one of his parents or one of his wife's parents. But it was just a lot of things to juggle on top of a day job, paying the rent, raising a child. And so our issue, this last issue, is double sized. It's in fact more than double sized because as we are heading to our $20,000 stretch goal, we are going to be adding an extra 8 story pages that Ruben's already drawn.
right.
So he kind of had to Shawshank his way through these pages a little bit.
Mhm.
And as I thought about it, I thought, I wanted this book to remain consistent. I wanted it to, from beginning to end, feel like a cohesive experience from the same creative team, that we're not changing artists midstream, that we're sort of keeping that high bar of quality that has defined the first two issues. And
Right.
also, I felt like I owed that to Ruben. He
Yeah, yeah.
really breathed life into the occupied zone with this sort of post-apocalyptic fantasy designs. And so, I said, like, let's just get it done when you can get it done. Chip your way through the pages. And when it is done, I had faith in our readership, our Emerald Army, our Yellow Brick Road Warriors, that they would come back because they believed in this book and this team in the same way that I did.
Yeah.
And so it took a few years for him to finish. I was in contact with Ruben um, about every other week since the last Kickstarter, just checking in, seeing how things were going. I'm sure he wanted to throttle me after a while, but I felt like I owed it to him. I felt like I owed it to our readers. And now the book's done,
Yeah.
100% done, 100% written, drawn, colored, lettered, ready to go to the printer. Um, but yeah, how did I come up with this idea? To circle back to your actual question. Um, this book dates back to the early days of my career. I wrote a book called Spencer in Locke, is my first book. It was
Yeah.
What if Calvin and Hobbes grew up in Sin City? About a hardboiled detective whose partner is his childhood imaginary friend, and kind of looking back at sort of the harrowing upbringing that requires him to hold on to this imaginary friend.
Right.
And when I wrote it, this love letter to Bill Watterson and Frank Miller, I knew that there were going to be some people who loved it for the audacity, and there were going to be some people who loved it when they realized we weren't doing it for shock value's sake, that there was like a real human story about trauma and mental illness and compassion,
Yeah.
being hard under it. And then there were going to be the purists. There were going to be some purists who hated it just because it existed, because we were taking one of comics' most deservedly sacred cows. Bill Watterson's a trailblazing pioneer,
Yeah.
and making a little bit of hamburger out of it. And so I didn't know how that book was going to go. I knew there was going to be a ratio one way or the other. And if it broke against us, I was like, I'm never doing this again. That first book was one of the hardest experiences of my entire life. Rewarding, but just very challenging. When the book came out, thankfully, people really liked that book. Overwhelmingly, people were behind that book. We were
Yeah.
nominated for 5 Ringo Awards when that book came out. People really were behind us from the jump. And
Mhm.
so, as the dust settled, I said, okay, maybe I can be a comic book writer. And so I started thinking of some other ideas of different genres I could play within, because I get restless easily and I didn't want to just commit to one specific genre where I would get tired.
Right.
And so I came up with a few ideas. I came up with Going to the Chapel, my Die Hard meets Wedding Crashers
Yeah.
book. I came up with my long gestating sci-fi book, Grand Theft Astro, which we're just kind of looking for the right publisher and the right artist to pick that up. We've also, and then we had the OZ. I thought that fantasy would be a fun genre to play with.
Right.
I love how fantasy you can play around with metaphor and theme and characterization,
Hmm.
and not be so rigid with the rules of the world, that you can bend them according to your characters and the story you're trying to tell. And so I wrote down just some, iconic fantasy stories, just, where could I draw inspiration from? And the same way that I drew inspiration from Calvin and Hobbes. And so I wrote down things like Lord of the Rings. I wrote down Harry Potter before we all learned she was a bigot. I wrote down The Wizard of Oz. And then my computer froze. Just the weird serendipity is my computer froze in the middle of the word Oz. My cursor was stuck in between that O and Z. And
Hmm.
as I waited for my old laptop to unfreeze, I'm staring at the screen and I see the cursor there. And I'm like, OZ, that could be like an acronym for something.
Right.
And so I started kind of playing around with words. And as soon as I hit occupied zone, sort of that concept hit me like a ton of bricks. Like the image of the first issue cover that's on our Kickstarter, it's like Ruben Rojas plucked it directly out of my head. Like the idea of Dorothy as this soldier, sitting in this war-torn magical battlefield, kind of giving us this 1,000-yard stare while you see this hulking juggernaut Tin Man behind her.
Right.
Uh, you know, the story just immediately kind of unfolded. And having read the original L. Frank Baum novels for a class in college on adolescent literature, I realized that just like Spencer and Locke, where the core concept became why did Calvin need to have an imaginary friend when he was an only child? I was an only child for 9 years. I didn't need an imaginary friend. I had real people friends. I realized that there was still an inconsistency, a question begged by the original text that could kind of take a whole story out of that. In this case, like I said, Dorothy either kills or deposes three out of the four major pillars of Oz and then vanishes. And she does it in like a week. That's not a happy ending. That speaks to that sort of fantasy war concept. That's the forever wars that we find
Yeah,
ourselves in. That regime change, deposing a regime is easy. Installing a new one that's stable and democratic is very, very hard.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I mean, you have people who this is all they knew, and now it's over, and the person they looked to have an answer is now gone. So who do you turn to?
yeah. So and that also spoke to not only the types of characters I like to write. I like to write characters with a past, people who maybe have their traumas and scars, and so we can kind of start them in a dark place, but then they can kind of have that redemptive climb out of it. That these scars in their past doesn't necessarily have to define them, and that's a theme I revisit a lot in my work. I did it in Spencer and Locke, and OZ, and Savage Avengers, and Space Ghost, and even Speed Racer to a lesser extent. Um, I like that. It gives characters room to grow, but it's also, I think, very inspiring for me as a reader, as a fan. And I
Mhm.
know I think everybody has a past. Everybody has something that kind of haunts them, or has scarred them. And I think if you see a character that can move past it, maybe not forget about it, but just sort of build
Yeah,
a newer, better future, despite all this, it brings a sense of hope. But also, it spoke to a time in my life. I've not served in the military, but once upon a time, I used to be a newspaper reporter. I interned in newsrooms all around the country in college, and right out of school, I was a newspaper reporter for the Berkshire Eagle in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. If there's any upstate New York fans or rural Mass fans, that's sort of where I was at. And I had like a little bit of a patchwork beat. I was general assignment, and so
right.
I did crime. I was sort of the night reporter for the crime beat. I did state politics, and I also sort of found myself in the local veterans beat. And so I remember doing a big feature story on what the local resources were for returning veterans coming home from overseas, in Berkshire County, Massachusetts, which often got the short end of the stick in terms of Massachusetts tax dollars. And so I wound up interviewing a lot of local veterans, people who had returned home from their time overseas, and hearing the stories of sort of the challenges they faced and the struggles they had of reintegrating back to civilian society. Not even counting if they were dealing with PTSD or traumatic brain injury or just
Right.
seeing combat, fearing for their lives, watching people that they serve with die in front of them or civilians, it took a toll. And I remember sort of taking all those stories and kind of really pouring them into Dorothy. This idea of this civilian society that you and I and even these soldiers grew up in a very natural way. And then they leave. They go overseas in this much more regimented environment where the stakes are different, the priorities are different, things are life and death. Sometimes their own lives have been endangered, and then they come back home, and it suddenly feels like a completely alien, foreign environment. The pacing is much more chaotic and unregimented and disorganized, and obviously the stakes are different. But there's nobody here to there's very little sort of support for people coming back.
Right.
And even just things that we take for granted, just like outside stimuli, fireworks, dropping of a plate. These are things that for you and me might seem relatively normal. But for, it can bring somebody back to like the worst moment of their lives. And so that sort of felt like a way to honor those stories and to really kind of justify the story that we're telling is I didn't want to tell a story that romanticized the idea of war. We do have sort of the Star Wars heightened adventure of it all, But I also wanted to like kind of shine a light at the human cost of all of it, and the unintended consequences of our good intentions, but
Right.
also, and this is I think the reason why this story continues to resonate, and why even though we've had a 5 year gap, people are coming back to see this story through, is you know we're living in a world where fascism is unfortunately alive and well.
Yeah.
It's creeping in at every corner. It's trying to exhaust us. It's trying to cow us into submission through intimidation. And so seeing somebody stand up to fight against that, somebody who maybe had a past and now sort of sees this as a second chance to make things right, I think that is a story that resonates in today's modern era. We have a line in this third issue, and it was one of the few changes I made beyond very spot fixes when I did the lettering pass. But this idea of whether you're in Oz or Iraq or America, that people gravitate towards strong men, that people who they will forgive a lot for somebody who's willing to bend or break or ignore the rules in order to get stuff done,
Yeah.
regardless of whatever moral compass there is. And that speaks to kind of our villain of the piece, the Scarecrow, in that he's one of my favorite villains I've ever written, in that he's sort of the tyrant of the OZ. But it's not like a switch flipped and he became a villain. He was the guy who wished for a brain. And
Yeah.
so that tactical genius is it was the closest any of Dorothy's former friends had to bringing any sort of semblance of order back to Oz. And yet, in a lot of ways, he sort of reflects a lot of anxieties I had starting out in my career. I used to be a critic, and I went into this business with a head full of theories, and I learned very quick when the rubber met the road which held up and which did not.
Yeah.
He's the critic turned pro in the worst kind of way, in that he had a lot of big ideas and he has been humbled a million times. He's the product of a million compromises and horrors and failures. And it's turned him into this sort of creature of rage and resentment and sadism. His sort of his best idea is to turn Oz into a war economy. That if he can find enough outgroups, he can sort of cow the rest of them into submission. But he knows how far he's fallen. And that's what I love most about him, is that he comes by it so honestly, is that he's got this, he's a shell of himself. He's been literally depleting himself to form this scarecrow army, taking pieces of himself to animate these things. But as you see in our preview pages, he feels so much resentment for the rest of them, because he's like, you left me all alone. You left me to fend for myself, and this is all I could come up with. And so the Scarecrow, he's got plans within plans. He's still a very smart guy, and you're going to see what some of those plans within plans are in our third issue. Dorothy's been looking for the Silver Slippers, she and her Yellow Brick Road warriors, um, because the Scarecrow wants to use them to invade our world next. He's sort of run out of room in Oz, and he thinks, all right, we'll find another place.
Yeah.
And yeah, at the end of our last issue, that quest that Dorothy's been on went sideways. They've been captured by the Scarecrow, and one of the Silver Slippers has latched itself to her boot. And so we open in this kind of game of wills between her and the Scarecrow, in that he can't kill her. It'll lose the enchantment if he does.
Right.
But if he can convince her to take it off, whether through torture or through torturing her friends, then his war machine continues unabated. And so it's sort of who's going to break first. Can the Scarecrow hit enough pressure points, or can Dorothy kind of figure out a way to escape? And that's going to sort of lead us to our big blockbuster, the Scarecrow War, kind of our big over the top action packed finale. That's why we are adding 8 more pages to the book, as I wanted to give that sort of some room to breathe. And so every character is going to have kind of a moment, something that tests them, something that changes them. We see, for example, the Tin Soldier, he's been destroyed and rebuilt enough times that he's become this sort of hulking juggernaut of scrap metal. He's seen enough people die that he's sort of had to turn his own heart off. And as Dorothy our new Dorothy has returned, it's sort of you see flickers of that heart starting to come back online. There's the Prince of Lions, who's super fun, sort of our stealth rogue character. He's the son of the courageous lion, the king of the animal kingdom, who, unbeknownst to his subjects, died in the opening days of the war. And so his son wears a mask, and basically everybody thinks it's his father who's just scarred under there. And meanwhile, he is freaking out underneath the mask. How was my father so fearless? How did he put aside his doubts in order to rule? And it's so tragic because we know the Cowardly Lion and what he used to be, and he had a lot of growth to get there. And so he and Dorothy are going to be, they're going to be see a lot of mutual respect in there. And the Prince of Lions is going to have his courage tested in a very profound and personal way in this issue. And then Jack Pumpkinhead, who, knowing that the Scarecrow is going to be off the board as our villain, we needed to sort of fill that gap. And I thought that Jack Pumpkinhead felt like kind of the right twist on the Scarecrow.
Yeah.
They're both, to use Pokemon
Both
terms,
like kind of
they're both,
constructs.
yeah, they're both plant-based.
Yeah.
And I also, Chrono Trigger was a big influence on this book in the way that we composed the team, sort of that jam band team of different genres. And I remember in that game, the wizard Magus, who is the villain for a good chunk of the story. And if you play the game right, you can put your differences aside and you can join the team. And Jack is sort of the Scarecrow's chief enforcer. He's sort of a mercenary for the highest bidder who's been tasked with hunting down Dorothy. And as we see in our preview pages, he has failed enough times that the Scarecrow's cutting him loose, which means that he's going to switch sides and join the side of the Angels.
Yeah.
I wrote a lot like Marvel's Taskmaster, with a little bit of Jack Skellington, a little bit of Green Goblin thrown in there, with his pumpkin glider and his jack-o'-lantern bombs. So yeah, it's sort of a fun group rounded out by Toto, who I you know I love I have a Karen Terrier. She's literally sitting right next to me, Ruby. I've had Karen Terriers my whole life, and so I always felt a kinship to Toto. And he has been, while we open the book, he's a dog. They don't live that long. We actually find out that he's absconded to Oz, and so animals live a lot longer over there, and he's developed the ability to talk. And so he's been running the resistance as the new Wizard of Oz. And Toto's such a fun sort of character in there. Terriers in general are little dogs with big dog energy. And the idea of him sort of running things in Dorothy's grandmother's absence was really poignant. And he's got a moment in this book that's, I think, my favorite moment in the entire series. And so this sort of kind of broken mirror remix of What You Think You Know, that speaks to, I think, the themes of the OZ. Dorothy's first line is, "There's no place like home." They say there's no place like home, but for me, home is just another place that doesn't exist anymore. And it speaks to sort of that struggle to reintegrate into a society that once was so normal to you. But it's also, how do you sort of untangle yourself from the past as a home you can never return to? These
Yeah.
memories might be a little distorted, a little idealized, and you see something as iconic and archetypical as the Wizard of Oz that's so baked into the cultural zeitgeist. Well, it's different from what you know.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that even speaks to today's society, that we live in dark times. And I think we're all in a sense of mourning. I think, we grow up with a certain ideal of what the country is supposed to be. And I think we're all disillusioned to it by some
Yeah.
extent, whether you're reading the history books or you're reading or headlines. But I think the last 10 years have been particularly dark. And I think we're all kind of collectively mourning those ideals that we thought the country, if it didn't stand for, was at least striving towards. And so it's, how do we sort of overcome
I,
that?
I I wonder at that a little bit, and I'm not pushing back, but just kind of looking at it from another perspective, because I also
Yeah.
kind of look at it as, I think it's in my opinion, it's the promise of what something should be versus the reality of what we see every
Yeah,
day. And I think more and
yeah,
more, especially in the last few years, we've seen, oh, well, this is where this is, I mean, especially younger people, are saying like, this is the thing that you all keep telling us is supposed to be in the world. This is what we're supposed to be seeing as right and good. And but every time we turn around, we're seeing what you do versus what you say. And they're
yeah,
completely different. But yeah, I
yeah.
absolutely understand what you
And yeah, I mean, I think it ultimately comes down to, like I said, that mode of storytelling that I like to tell, which is I don't mind doing some subversion of something that everybody knows and loves. I mean, I think the more you know and love it, the more effective the subversion can be, as long as it's something rooted in the text. I don't want to do a story that's shock for shock value's sake. That's you might get your foot in the door once doing that, but that doesn't build emotional investment. That doesn't build sort of that repeat readership that you need as a professional comics writer. Um, but yeah, I think it speaks to, again, the redemptive climb. That if you start with sort of this kind of, darker version of something, as long as the character can kind of redeem themselves and climb their way out, I think that journey's worth it. I don't want to write something to be bleak. I want to give our readers a sort of a satisfying character arc and maybe a sense of inspiration or hope. And I think Dorothy is one of those characters that where she starts from is so textured and so granular and so rooted in our real world that, at least for me, writing it and reading it, it feels so satisfying to kind of see where she winds up in all of this. But like I said, there's a bunch of twists and turns in this third issue that we've been keeping in the back pocket since the very beginning. And when you find out what they are, when Dorothy finds out what they are, it's going to turn the whole series on its ear. And so I'm very excited for people to get to check that one out. But the thing is also, it's Kickstarter, and Kickstarter offers so many different opportunities that you wouldn't get to do in the direct market. When I'm writing something in the direct market, I have my 20 or 22 pages, and that's all I can sell you with. In Kickstarter, there's a lot more levers. There's a lot more ways I can think outside of the box. And
mean.
so, for example, we've got, not only is this issue double sized. Right now, it's 44 pages. When we hit 20,000, it's going to be 52 pages plus another 8 pages, I believe, of pinups from a murderer's row of talent. We've got Hannah Templer. We've got Justin Mason. We've got Devlin Baker, we've got Tom Hoskison, we've got Chris Evanhuis. We've got a lot of really fun artists, who we've been saving sort of for a rainy day. We've also got our stretch goals. So beyond doing things like the bonus pages, I can say, like, we're going to have another stretch goal coming up, where in lieu of doing a print this Kickstarter, we are doing a fully illustrated map of the occupied zone. And when we hit that goal, that is going to be for all of our backers. So that's going to be kind of a fun thing, to unveil once we hit this first stretch goal. We've also got a limited edition bookmark from Ruben Mocho. And that will also have a QR code that'll lead us to one of my favorite rewards. We have a mini EP of OZ songs recorded by my good friend George Marston, who did Heart of Tin as our theme song for the first campaign. They've recorded two more songs for one for each issue. So you'll be able to get all that once we sort of roll that out as well. Um, Also, we've got print and digital catch-up tiers because, like I said, I've had a whole career since the last Kickstarter. There are a lot of people who didn't know about this book. So you can catch up on the whole series. You can get all 3 issues at a discount. You can get everything in digital at a discount, or you can mix and match between all 14 variant covers that we've done across all 3 issues. We've also, I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce people to my other work. And so we've got every single trade I've ever worked on available as individual add-ons or bundled together at discounted sets. So you can get my Marvel work, like Savage Avengers and Moon Knight City of the Dead and Cable Love and Chrome and Punisher. You can get both both volumes of Space Ghost Volume 1. The first one is currently out of print. You can get Captain Planet and both volumes of Speed Racer. You can get Spencer and Locke and Going to the Chapel and Scouts Honor, all of which are out of print, and The Devil That Wears My Face. You can mix and match between all of these. And also, we've learned from the previous campaigns, particularly in how do we get everybody their rewards as fast as humanly possible? Because I fully understand we've made people wait long enough, and I said I didn't want to launch the campaign until everything was done, and I wanted to make sure everybody got their books as fast as humanly possible. And so what we're doing, not only have we sort of structured the campaign that it's very user friendly. When these surveys are done, all I have to do is get your name and shipping address. That's it. But also, we're working with our amazing printers at Comic Impressions, who have printed the previous two issues, so they have a sense of what everything's supposed to look like. But also, we are working with the amazing fulfillment team at Laguna Studios to handle all the fulfillment. So that way, you don't have to worry about a guy who's writing 4 books and has a baby due, packing and shipping all your stuff. These guys are professionals. They've fulfilled over 50 campaigns already. They came very highly recommended from a lot of people in the Kickstarter sphere who I've come to trust. And so we're very excited to be working with them. Having spoken with Laguna Studios and having spoken with Comic Impressions, right now we have a December estimated time for everybody getting their rewards to get everybody their books for the holidays. However, I anticipate, so long as our printer doesn't get hit by a hurricane like it did the last time, um, I think everybody's going to get their rewards significantly earlier than that.
Good.
Uh, because yeah, I've long believed our Emerald Army has waited long enough, and we're really trying to make sure that you guys don't have to wait 1 second longer than you have to.
Yeah.
So
There are going to be
yeah,
links to all of this in the in the description of this episode, throughout this episode, and all the social media surrounding this episode when it launches. So there's gonna be no excuse for not being able to click that link.
it's a fun series. Like I said, if you've missed out on our previous campaigns, you can get caught up very, very easily. Uh, as of this recording, we have 375 backers. We are almost at 17,000. So yeah, join the OZ. I promise you will not regret it.
All right. David, thank you so much again for being on the fan cast. I love talking to you.
My
I
pleasure.
love not only hearing your passion for the things that you do, but you get me hyped for the things that you're doing as well. So I'm really not only looking forward to the next arcs in Space Ghost, not only looking forward to this continuing arc in Speed Racer, but I'm absolutely like I'm on as we've been talking, I'm on the page right now. I'm on your Kickstarter. I'm looking at the OZ because I want to get involved and I definitely want to read this story just based on everything that we've talked about. So I'm definitely recommending it to everyone as well.
Thank you. I will say, our team, which has remained consistent from beginning to end, and it's why it's taken so long in between issues 2 and 3. Ruben Rojas and our amazing colorist Whitney Kogar and our amazing letter DC Hopkins. This book was a leap of faith for me in a lot of ways. That's what I love about Kickstarter. It's so empowering for creators that you don't have to wait for permission to tell your stories, but we really took a leap of faith. And I believed in this team. I believed in the story. I believed in the execution. And I thought, all right, we're going to take this jump and I think the readers will come. And they've supported us every step of the way. And this book has made such a profound difference in my career and in my life. I always say the first issue of this book helped get me noticed by Marvel. It won us the entire team the Ringo Award for Best Single Issue, which I think is so fitting because this book is such a team effort. Even, like I said, I'm about to become a father, and like in the days after the campaign wraps, and real talk, I wouldn't have been able to afford doing IVF to bring this baby into existence if I hadn't done the OZ. So this book has had a profound material difference on my entire family. This is a book I believe in with every fiber of my being. This is the sort of the biggest leap of faith in my career since Spencer and Locke. And so I think this is the OZ is genuinely some of my best work. I think it's one of the most beautiful books I've ever worked on, thanks to our amazing creative team. And yeah, that's why I've been pushing this book so hard, is I want as many people to read this book as possible because, like I said, I think it's some of my best work.
Awesome. And like I said before, we're gonna have links to everything throughout this episode and in all the descriptions. But if you want people to follow you on social media, or if you have any other links you want to
Sure.
let them know about, just let them know.
Yeah. Well, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Pepos D. It's just my last name and first initial, or David Pepose Comics on Facebook. You can go to my website at davidpepose.com. And you can back the Kickstarter at tinyurl.com/the OZ comic. And we will be glad to bring you on board as a Yellow Brick Road Warrior.
All right, David Pepos, thank you again so much. I really appreciate it, and I want to when you reach your stretch goals, when you get everything funded, please come back and let's talk some more because I'm
Absolutely.
because you can talk to me not only as a fan but also as a backer because I'm backing this project right now.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And thank you for everyone watching and listening. I always say this in every interview, but I would not be able to have this career if it wasn't for just the army of readers and retailers and press and fans and editors and collaborators who've really championed my career and my work every step of the way. I'm always grateful for it. This is what inspires me to get up and try to deliver my A game every single day. So thank you for having me. The pleasure was all mine.
I appreciate the opportunity as well. Thank you.